Tito steps back in time some 44 years, retracing the steps of other soldiers from the 28th Division of the Pennsylvania Army National Guard. They, too, went to France for a different war, but also ready to die for freedom. Tonight, we hear from those lucky ones who made it back home.
The 28th Division landed on the beaches of Normandy July 22, 1944, just weeks after D-Day. There were 15,000 division soldiers who fought in the Second World War, and by the time it ended in 1945, less than half of them survived.
We saw the utter destruction and of course, bloated carcasses of animals and some human dead.
Haas was wounded during the American sweep through western France. He was forced to leave the 28th just 3 weeks before the troops he helped train led the famous march through the Arc de Triomphe, a march celebrating the liberation of Paris from the Germans. George Mosier and Bill Dixon were there.
I guess it was an honor, but at that time, you're fighting a war. You don't think of nothing else. The French people was very, very happy. We had arrived with, at attention with our arms folded somewhere in this manner. Our division band played at the reviewing stand. I don't know who else was on the division stand. I remember that de Gaulle was there.
George Mosier was pictured in a U.S. stamp later made from this march, and he remembers this scene as the quiet before the storm.
After we paraded through Paris there, we started right in fighting again.
They had to go either around or through Paris. The most expeditious way was to march right down the middle of the city. And that's what they did, marched into the city and then right into the front line.
By November 1944, the 28th had pushed toward Belgium and were struck at the Siegfried Line. Here in the heavily wooded Hurtgen forest, the division lost thousands of men to the Germans, set up in pillboxes and concrete bunkers.
They had shell bursts, treetop level. Not much way you could protect yourself from it.
Despite the heavy losses, they won their objective, only to be struck again in the Battle of the Bulge. During this conflict, in the dead of winter, the 28th was ordered to hold at all costs, but were outnumbered by nearly 10 to 1. The slaughter was so fierce, the German army dubbed this group of soldiers and their Keystone insignia the Bloody Bucket Division. Those who were captured, like Dixon, were locked in railroad boxcars, facing starvation.
They give you one loaf of bread for 3 guys to last you 3 days.
Some 6 months later, VE Day was declared, and the war was over.
I think everybody felt that it was inevitability that we would win. I think there was never any doubt about our winning. It was just how long it would take.
Chateau TV 10 Action News.
Keystone Country Journal, a chronicle of people, places, and lifestyles that make up the patchwork quilt of central Pennsylvania.
Hi everybody, I'm Barbara Petito and welcome to this special edition of the Keystone Country Journal. What you're about to see tonight are the highlights of a week-long trip photographer Bennett Vaughn and I took with the 28th Division Band of the Pennsylvania Army National Guard. Our cameras were on board as we traveled thousands of miles to France, where the Guard was asked to take part in ceremonies marking the 70th anniversary of World War I. It was the first time any unit of the 28th has been back to this country since 1944, a country the predecessors of this division helped liberate in part from fierce attacks by the Germans. The band's hometown is Altoona, but we begin our story at their summer training camp down south. We started our journey at Fort A.P. Hill, Virginia. The time is 0:30, or to us civilians, 5:30 in the morning. Half awake yet anxious, the band loaded the rest of its gear, and the caravan of 2 buses and a U-Haul set out in the hazy morning for Andrews Air Force Base. By sunup, the temperatures had soared into the 80s, but the heat was secondary as we got our first glimpse of the C-130 that would carry us 7,600 miles over the next 7 days. Normally hauling jeeps and other light equipment, this enormous plane within minutes became a giant tour bus, stacked with tubas, drums, a piano, and enough suitcases to frighten the boldest of baggage carriers.
Coming right here.
Once the cargo was secured, the passengers climbed on board. The flight staff, dressed in green jumpsuits, handed out box lunches and earplugs, which at the time, this civilian would have gladly traded for a parachute. Inside, the living quarters were tight. We sat shoulder to shoulder and knee to knee in canvas web seats. It was loud in there, and you had to really shout to be heard. But when the minutes turned into hours, it was obvious these soldiers were no strangers to even the most uncomfortable of environments. We flew almost 8 hours that day before making our first stop at Lajes Air Force Base in the Azores, a small Portuguese island tucked far away into the Atlantic. Losing about 4 hours with the time change, the next day the band had little time for sightseeing before their first scheduled performance in front of American military families based here.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 28th Infantry Division Band.
Talking to the audience, this concert was a very welcomed event.
This is very rare. This is a great treat, really.
We're 2,200 miles from New York City and 800 miles from the continent, so we're stuck out in the middle of the Atlantic, and something like this, it brings home to us.
Does it make you feel like you're back home, or?
Well, not so much back home. It makes you feel proud to be an American, just like the tunes you played for the armed services, you know. Everybody gets that little tingle and that little twinge. So it does make you feel good.
Now, this is great. You know. I'm glad to see we got a good turnout out here. And plus the fact they're from Pennsylvania, and that's where I was born and raised.
So this is like back home
for you? This is back home for me.
I think it's absolutely just wonderful. Really, really good.
You like them?
Yes.
Are they playing a lot of songs you know?
No.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That was just the Armed Forces salute.
So with the first concert coming to a close here at the Azores, the band will now pack up its gear, and in about 8 hours from now, it's off to Paris. Reflections of War continues right after this. After leaving the Azores, the band was geared up for the final 5-hour flight to Paris, more than 1,500 miles away. With less than 4 hours sleep and another 2 hours lost in time changes, you began to feel the true meaning of jet lag. But too excited to rest once in France, the group boarded a tour bus headed for an historical perspective of Chateau Thiery. It was here that the predecessors of this division 70 years ago fought alongside the French to secure their freedom under siege by the Germans. This was the first stop upon arriving in Chateau Thiery. It's called the American Memorial, one of the largest of its kind outside of the U.S. Built by the U.S. government in 1929, it stands proud on top of this hill to remember all the servicemen who fought here in World War I. The United States has spent $280,000 over the last 4 years to restore this monument, a visual symbol of the long-lasting friendship between the U.S. and France. The huge sacrifices that were made by Americans here were summed up by an inscription on this memorial, which says, "Time will not dim the glory of their deeds." 28th Division Commander Major General Vernon E. James says, while some Pennsylvanians may have forgotten what their boys did here, the French will not.
The 28th Division were the liberators in many, many cases, and fighting alongside and with the French to secure their freedoms. And that red Keystone was the rallying cry of the French people.
Is this bridge the same bridge as today?
In another gesture of friendship, more than 24 French families opened their doors to the band, allowing them to stay at their homes during our visit in their city. Many of the host families did not speak English, but found that was the only thing they didn't have in common with their new American friends.
She'd say that she wanted to learn English last year, and she regrets now.
When we found out about coming on this trip, we were looking very forward to meeting people from another country.
What did they specifically want to know about them?
Qu'est-ce que vous avez envie de savoir d'eux, de leur façon de vivre?
Tout, parce qu'on n'y connaît rien.
Tout. Everything, because they don't know anything about the United States.
That's a good start.
Patricia had the impression the United States was big and just kind of a crazy was the term she used, and I had to explain that some parts of the country are a little bit different, but Altoona is basically a small hometown.
Pictures filled in the gaps, and soon the different tongues were one.
Altoona, not New York, okay, not Baton Rouge, okay.
Hopefully when we get back home, we want to keep a relationship with the people that we have met.
We'll be back with more reflections of war in a moment. The next 2 days would be the most important appearances this band would make in France. Getting back to their instruments for the first time since the Azores, however, took a little adjusting.
Too early.
But after a few polishes and making sure the sheet music was in order, this band and its color guard were ready to begin.
To your right, Gibby.
This morning's ceremonies were 2 separate tributes to the Frenchmen and Americans who fought and died in this once battle-torn land. Like the soldiers in wartime, here too the French and American bands stood side by side, remembering those who made freedom possible. Wreaths were laid at the foot of the French War Dead Memorial as their 39th Division band played Le Marseillaise, their country's national anthem. In a march through the streets of Chateau Thiery, the ceremony then moved to the American War Dead Memorial. 2 wreaths were also placed here, and for the first time in more than 4 decades, the French heard a U.S. military band play our national anthem. Afternoon, these World War I anniversary ceremonies took us outside of Chateau Thiery to Belleau Wood, some 200 acres of land which proved to be the key battle in halting one of the last German offensives. It was here in these trenches that the American and French troops began a series of attacks which in less than 4 months ended the war. So these are guns that we used?
These are American guns given to the U.S. Army by the French. These are 75 millimeter guns.
The crank on that's what brings it up and down. These are the kind that my grandfather used when he was in World War I.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Rapidly occupying defensive positions south and west of Belleau Wood The 4th Marine Brigade.
Not far away from this battlefield stands the Ames Marne American Cemetery and Chapel. Here, the two bands paid a final tribute to the more than 2,000 U.S. soldiers who never made it back home. Watching outside the chapel was a French woman named Gabrielle Viam. Her devotion to the Allied cause during the Second World War earned her this Freedom Medal from the United States government. Wearing it proudly today, Gabrielle remembers how she saved the American paratroopers from falling into the Germans' clutches.
Je l'ai même promené dans Paris.
She explained that if you were not German now, it's grace of American soldiers during World War I and World War II.
From the Ames Marne Memorial, the band paraded once again through the narrow streets of Chateau Thiery to City Hall. Here, they will be officially honored by the mayor of this city. In a translated speech, the mayor said Chateau Thiery will be forever grateful to the men of this division, for they were the liberators. And in his words, what would we be if not free? After a few brief words of thanks, bandmaster Richard Potter presented the mayor with a painting of the Men of Iron, a name that stuck with the 28th Division for their iron-like strength during World War I. Along with the painting of the Guard in action, the mayor was given a medallion and division patch, the same red Keystone which was referred to by the Germans in World War II as the Bloody Bucket. A patch the band was asked to wear on this trip in memory of the heavy casualties the 28th suffered during the Battle of the Bulge. As a token of appreciation from the band's hometown of Altoona, the mayor received a golden spike symbolizing the railroad industry and a baseball cap which required little coaxing to display. Champagne topped off the ceremony, and the two bands stepped out of their formations for a series of toasts. This would be the beginning of a kinship that none would replace.
So he is very optimistic about the relation between France and the United States, because he says that even during wartime or even during peacetime, the relations are always good. So he says that it will continue.
Much of what we've seen so far has been of a solemn nature, but not all reflections of war evoke sorrow and pain. There were, of course, celebrations, a triumphant cry throughout much of the world that the fighting was over. And in the true spirit of victory, these two bands shared those moments as well, a sense of camaraderie only the soldiers before them could explain.
How do you say a toast? I forget. Say it again. Santé.
This was lunchtime in Chateau Thiery, the first real relaxing moment these band members had with each other. It was a time to let loose, drink wine, and break the language barrier with song. there was at least one melody everybody knew. So as not to be outdone by the American singing abilities, a sort of impromptu stage show got underway. Here, the French proved they too have outside talents invisible from the band. And as if they hadn't played enough today, the French put on their own musical show, this time for their new American friends. There was an almost magical spell in this room that could have lasted a lifetime. But as the hour drew near for their next performance, it was time to go, but not before one last song. That afternoon, there was no better way to maintain the band's high spirit than to take part in a marching parade. Each summer in Chateau Thiery, the streets closed down for several days for a giant festival honoring Jean de La Fontaine, a world-known writer who was born here. The 28th Division Band represented the United States in this parade and was one of 6 bands from as many countries throughout Europe. The parade route poured out in front of City Hall to an entirely different audience, waiting patiently in the stands. Sprinkled throughout the crowd were the host families who looked on with a unique sense of pride, similar to a parent watching their own child perform. By nightfall, a repeat of this parade took place. Only giant floats with elaborate decorations were added. The streets swelled with people some 15 deep in places to see what promised to be the best festival anyone could remember. In these last 2 parades, the French took particular notice of the Americans' presence. For those who remember the war some 44 years ago, seeing the American flag stirred deep emotions. Emotions and curiosity the color guard sensed immediately.
People trying to touch us, people coming up to the United States flag and grabbing it, kissing it. It's just wonderful and made you feel very, very patriotic.
I could feel people brushing up against me, and they were so amazed. I think probably that, number one, I was a female and that I was carrying the weapons. I mean, it really makes me proud to be an American.
When I'm standing in a color guard and there's something emotional going on, like the playing of Star Spangled Banner or anything, I get tears in my eyes and I say, oh, I hope the flag goes in front of my face, so nobody sees.
To the French children, this was a circus on wheels. Many carried lit candles as they followed behind the band, making its final appearance in Chateau Thiery before thousands. conclusion of Reflections of War, Chateau Thiery, it was off to Paris. And like true American tourists, our eyes were fixed on the skyline for anything that closely resembled the Eiffel Tower. Like Chateau Thiery, Paris is filled with history the 28th Division helped make. Back in World War II, it was the predecessors of this Army National Guard who were among the hundreds of soldiers leading the march through the Arc de Triomphe, a march that symbolized the liberation of Paris from the Germans. But today, this is a very different city, packed with tourists and local sightseers, some too young to picture a war here, and maybe that's just as well. For the band, there were a few hours of free time before their concert in Paris. The first stop on their mini tour, what else? The Eiffel Tower.
I think I would be higher. It would take you about a half hour to walk up.
I didn't realize you could do that. They're walking up and down that thing.
No way. Sorry.
I think it's great.
Smile! This is the most visited site in France, and though the band spent less than an hour here, there were enough pictures taken to fill 100 photo albums. By that afternoon, the band was back into their dress greens for a special outdoor garden concert. The audience slowly moved into their chairs to hear a program that took days of intensive rehearsal to prepare.
For this particular year, which is of course special than anything we've done before, we took our first 8 days of our AT training, our 2-week encampment, and that's the main time when we put this program together.
To many of the Parisians, this was an unfamiliar sight. Americans performing in their city playing songs they haven't heard in more than 40 years. Others, not believing these men could have traveled this far, checked the list of scheduled performances mounted alongside the band shell. And even if you didn't know the music, this was a great time for the French families to share a moment together.
The audience was the type that musicians always hope that they will have. People who appreciate what you're doing up there and respond so warmly and just make you feel that they really enjoyed having you there.
Instead of giving 100% to the French people, we gave 110% for the concert.
But I think down deep in my heart, I knew that when we got here, with all that I had felt about French and all that before, that these people would respond, and they certainly didn't disappoint me.
Paris was the last stop for the band, which played here in Luxembourg Gardens. And even though they only stayed a brief time in this city, they will take back with them memories that'll last a lifetime.
We didn't know what we was going to expect when we got over here in this country. So they really took us in as just like a family.
It does give me a very special feeling when I see foreigners and responding so greatly to our music.
It gives you a good feeling. It really does. It's you're bonding two countries together, and you're doing it with music. It's fantastic.
Spectacular. Very warm. Very uplifting for us.
What was going through your mind while you were playing tonight?
Just a feeling of being real proud and happy. I've been in the band for 36 years, and it is one of the best receptions that the band has ever gotten. And when the hair stands up on the back of my neck at a concert, it means something.
Give you a kind of different perspective about the French people?
It really does. It really has, and will from now on.
The fact that they are so nice and so friendly and so loving is just extraordinary.
It's just something I'll never, ever forget.
There is no doubt this unit of the 28th Division touched the people of Chateau Thiery in Paris. And as these French children grow up, maybe their parents will remind them of the day the Americans played here. Present politics aside, in their own small way, this unit of the 28th did its part in carrying out a continued friendship between the two countries that would last forever. Coming home, they felt their mission was accomplished.
Personally, I thought we did the United States and the state of Pennsylvania and everybody proud. We did one heck of a job.
In conclusion, we'd like to extend a special thanks to the Guard for allowing us on this trip. Here at TV10, we agree with Major General Vernon E. James, who refers to his unit as the oldest, the proudest, and the best. Until next time, good night.